All right. You're good, because we're finishing up the lesson. So, mobilizing for war. But thank you for asking. All right. So America is unprepared for a world war. We are not ready for this kind of mobilization. We haven't raised an army this big since what war? Civil War. Very good. And we're going to have to take this army across the globe. That wasn't the case going on in the Civil War, all right? So this is going to take some time. Wilson is going to establish the Council of National Defense to study issues in relation to logistics, mobilization, and it's also a major shipbuilding program. Notably, a couple of parts of the program, the Clemson class destroyer program, as well as the L-class submarine program, come out of this. America's Army, upon our entry, or at least when we declared war, 15th largest army in the world. We did rank in the top 10 in terms of Navy, but keep in mind, our Army and our Navy are far flung. They're all over the place. We have American ground troops that are training on the East Coast, in the Deep South, in the Midwest, on the West Coast. We have soldiers in Hawaii and in Guam and Midway and Philippines and Wake Island and the Caribbean. We're really scattered out. Our Navy is also a bit scattered at this period of time. So mobilization is going to be key for our entry. No one else, well, another issue here is that people didn't really know how much we could produce, but also how fast we could get it to its destination, because we're talking about war supply, food, soldiers. This is a pretty significant undertaking. Britain had instituted a draft in 1916, just 5 weeks after America entered World War I. We are going to institute the draft through a congressional act known as the Civil Service Act. The Civil Service Act still exists to this day. And remember, this was challenged not only in Congress, but it was also challenged in the courts. We talked about that previously. We talked about Debs v. U.S. and Shank v. U.S. that challenged both the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Well, interwoven in that challenge was the draft, but the draft remained. In March of 1918, President Wilson established the War Industries Board. This is like the mechanization and build-up for the war effort. It also leads to the sale of war bonds and liberty loans to raise money. War bonds weren't new. When did we see war bonds before? Civil War. Very good. The U.S. also raised the graduated income tax. Do you think that was popular? No. Especially very, very unpopular with the wealthy. They didn't want to be flipping the bill for this massive mobilization. The National War Labor Board was established, headed by William Howard Taft and Frank P. Walsh. Taft, past president, ultimately Supreme Court Chief Justice. Why would Taft be a good person to lead this organization? What had Taft's job been during the Roosevelt administration? Teddy Roosevelt, that is. Remember, Taft was not a vice president. Taft was a secretary of what? You're good. Secretary of War. Very good. Nice job. Well done. Many, as we already mentioned previously, a lot of unskilled workers are against the war. But a lot of skilled labor unions, like the AFL, supported the war because it meant that there was going to be plenty of work, and most of the skilled professions would be able to easily pivot toward war production. Women provided a much needed boost to the labor demands in this war. Just like we saw happen with the American Civil War, and as I've said before, women win wars. Women go into the workforce, they go into agriculture, they go into nursing, and they go into other auxiliary fields connected to the armed forces. Not like on the level that we'll see in World War II, but it's significant. So much so, this is going to have an impact on voting rights. The ladies are going to be able to use their experience from World War I as a springboard to solidify the passage of the 19th Amendment. So we have some propaganda. We talked about the Creel Committee propaganda machine, the Committee on Public Information. This one is encouraging Americans to grow victory gardens during the war on the left, and this on the right is a piece of propaganda promoting the Liberty Loan campaign that was led by the Boy Scouts. So typically when we think about the Boy Scouts, they're out there selling popcorn. Well, in this situation, they're pushing for the purchase of Liberty loans and war bonds. Why are war bonds an easy way to make cash for the government in time of war?
Like an IOU.
Yeah, it's like an IOU. Excellent. I mean, but if you sit on your bonds, they owe you interest. All right. Preparing the doughboys for the Great War. Why do we call them the doughboys? For a couple of reasons. It has very little to do with Pillsbury. Do you know why? Anybody know? Yeah?
Their uniform got wet with grain.
Very good. It also had to do with pipe clay. They were issued pipe clay for cleaning their uniform, and a lot of times they're covered in this pipe clay and they look like they're covered in flour, so they get the name doughboys. And also connected to like them being covered in dust, so that's how that whole thing comes about. So the war continued to wage on the Western Front in Belgium and France, but as you already know, this is a far-flung affair, right? It's being fought on the Eastern Front, the Western Front, North Africa, across the Mediterranean, into the Atlantic. World War I's happening all over the place. The majority of American forces, though, are going to wind up on the Western Front because the Allies were in desperate need of soldiers, nurses, and supplies. A general we've already learned about, General Leonard Wood from the Spanish-American War, who had served as one of the commanders of the Rough Riders with Teddy Roosevelt, helped form the National Security League to push for the expansion of the draft. There's something very different about this draft than what we saw in the American Civil War. In the Civil War, in both the North and the South, there were ways to get out of the draft. Or in the North, in the Civil War, you can actually pay a substitute to take your place. That will not be the case. And the War Industries Board, as well as the Labor Committee headed by Taft, also decided that they were going to round up unemployed men and force them into the draft to become trained and to become employed. So the Selective Service Act, not only is it going to stick, even though it was challenged in the courts and was passed by Congress, but it still exists to this day. Luckily, a lot of patriotic men and women signed up for service. It's estimated that 2.8 million men were drafted. Within just a few months, the Army had grown from about 300,000 to roughly 4 million men and women. And just to put it into perspective, about a quarter of that number are going to be ground troops in Europe. Roughly about 1 million soldiers, overwhelmingly fighting on the Western Front. African Americans were allowed in the Army, but were still fighting in segregated units and largely in non-combat roles. Though there are going to be some famous African American infantry units like the Harlem Hellfighters, who were highly decorated in World War I, involved in trench warfare. We also have numerous African Americans joining up with the French to serve in combat roles. And a lot of those folks that served with the French, they actually stay in France after the war, because what do they have to return back home to when the war is over? Racism, and also what else? Jim Crow. Very good. Excellent job. Training was super rushed. So much so that a lot of soldiers wound up in combat and they barely knew how to use their rifles or use their bayonets. Also, disease was a huge problem. Does anybody know what big, nasty disease spread all over the world during this war?
The Spanish flu.
Spanish flu. That was a big problem in America because it was a pandemic or even an epidemic when soldiers left, and it got even worse when they returned back. So in the top left, we have the Harlem Hellfighters. Bottom left, we have 2 U.S. Marines and a nurse from the American Red Cross. And over on the right, that's what the average doughboy looked like during World War I. Questions up to this point? You guys good? All right. New technologies in World War I. We talked about dramatic technological advancement in the Civil War. This is another one where we see crazy rapid technological advancement in a 4-year period. So we have trench warfare. Barbed wire separated the trenches into no man's land in between, which was horrifically deadly. Airplanes, the Newport, the Sopwith Camel, and the Fokker Eindecker right here. These are going to be deadly machines. So, what I want you all to think about here that I've mentioned before, the Wright brothers in 1902 and 1903 are flying a wooden glider in Kitty Hawk. In less than 20 years, bombs are dropping over Europe from the air. That is rapid advancement in technology. Poison gas, mustard gas, and chlorine gas. Not only were these thrown in grenade form, but gas was also propelled by cannon and dropped from the air. This was horrifically deadly in the trenches. This is the birth of tank warfare. The Brits with the Little Willie and the Mark I, aka Mother. Also, the Americans get in the mix, and everybody's experimenting with tank warfare at this period of time. Does anybody know the famous young American officer who becomes the leader of the American Tank Corps in World War I and revolutionizes tank warfare heading into World War II? Has anybody ever heard of George S. Patton before? Okay. If you haven't heard of Patton, you will. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Patton today, but especially during World War II. Machine guns, the Vickers, the Browning, could fire 300 rounds per minute. Hand grenades, all different types of hand grenades. You have brass, iron, gas grenades. The list just goes on and on and on. Flamethrowers, very, very deadly, not only in no man's land and in the trenches, but also very dangerous for the person that had this flamethrower on their back. Key rifles from the from World War One, the 1903 Springfield American rifle, the 1917 Enfield British rifle, and the German Mauser. They also made a pistol. Submarines, German U-boats, British Q-boats, and the U.S. L-class. Our submarine warfare doesn't become super advanced until we get to World War II. Why were Zeppelins dangerous? Any ideas what made Zeppelins so dangerous? Anybody know?
Catch on fire.
Yeah, they could explode in air without being shot at. But they were easy targets to shoot at, especially with anti-aircraft howitzers. Balloons were used for reconnaissance. This is one of the most forgotten advancements of World War I, anti-aircraft howitzers. These howitzers were not only developed to shoot down planes, but they were deadly accurate for shooting rounds of ammunition as well as gas into targets that were far off between trenches. So this is a major development during World War I. This is one of my favorite World War I pictures because there's just so much going on with like the old style and the new style of combat. You have tanks, you have horses, you have wagons, trucks, howitzers, infantry, rifles, like so much is happening here. This is modern war. I mean, and obviously, like we talked about the modern mechanization of warfare in the American Civil War as well. Questions up to this point? All right. Fighting on the Eastern and Western Front. After the Bolsheviks took control of Russia, they withdrew from World War I, freeing up thousands of German troops to fight on the Western Front with the Bulgarians. German predictions of American tardiness to combat proved accurate. It took America time to get large ground forces to the front. I mean, we enter the war in 1917 in April, but we really don't have a large troop presence in Europe until like the spring, summer of 1918. Major transportation and logistical issues here. The American doughboys slowly poured into Europe, mainly on the Western Front, though 5,000 U.S. troops did serve with the Allies on the Eastern Front at Archangel. This was a Russian invasion to prevent munitions from falling into the hands of the Germans. The Bolsheviks were fired up about this because they felt like this was an interference in their communist takeover, and it nearly led to an international event, but Russia wasn't really trying to get into the war on the side of the Central Powers. Cooler heads prevailed, and as I said before, most of our American forces are going to be stationed on the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, French commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch prevented Germans from an invasion into Paris. He is one of the most famous commanders of World War I. He was the hero of the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. This spring maneuver and defensive gave the American reinforcements enough time to arrive to provide support to the French, the British, and the Belgians. But it's mainly the Americans and the French in this mopping up campaign toward the end of World War I on the Western Front. The Second Battle of the Marne is the turning point battle of World War I on the Western Front. Allies forced a German withdrawal that was never again effectively reversed, but it was horrifically deadly. Guys, this is more than a battle. It's more like a campaign because it lasted from July to August. And this particular campaign was somewhere between about 60 to 100 miles long along the trenches. The Americans demanded that they have their own commander on the ground. The Allies will agree to this. The American commander on the ground, General John J. Blackjack Pershing, West Point class of 1886. We learned a little bit about him before. He is the American commander of U.S. forces in Mexico against Pancho Villa. And some of his young commanders in that conflict are going to serve on the ground here in World War I. One very important person who does not serve against Pancho Villa, but had a major command in the Philippines, is Colonel George C. Marshall, VMI graduate, class of 1901. Marshall is going to become Pershing's right-hand man. He also goes on to do much of the planning for what becomes known as the Meuse-Argonne offensive heading into the end of the summer and fall of 1918. This is kind of like the last push. It's also horrifically deadly for the Americans. This is a very, very deadly campaign. But I want y'all to keep in mind that in the total death toll of World War I, American casualties made up roughly just about 2%. All right? So most of the deaths were European or Middle Eastern or North African. Okay. Beyond Marshall, some other important figures: Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Rainbow Division in World War I, and George S. Patton, commander of the Tank Division. These guys are going to go on to become leading commanders in World War II. George C. Marshall becomes Army Chief of Staff during World War II. He will then go on to become Secretary of Defense and later Secretary of State, and he's the guy that issues the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. Douglas MacArthur becomes the U.S. Army commander of all U.S. Army forces in the Pacific. Both of those guys are going to be 5-star generals. Patton, 3-star general, becomes leading tank commander in World War II. We'll talk more about his service later. It's a little bit complicated. We'll discuss it as we move into World War II. Another famous American, we've all heard of the Red Baron, right? The German flying ace. Well, our American flying ace was Eddie Rickenbacker. He is going to win the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service in World War I. So we've got an Air Corps involved in this war as well. Okay, so on the top left, this is the Western Front. Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and just beyond the edges of the map there, Germany. And you can see how far the line got here to prevent a German invasion of Paris. But Paris will ultimately be occupied when we get into World War II. Bottom left, trench warfare. Top right, Pershing. Bottom right, George C. Marshall. And Marshall will go on to serve as Pershing's military aide-de-camp after the war. All right, so the Meuse-Argonne offensive, as I previously mentioned, horrifically deadly, cost thousands of American lives. But there are some significant moments in this offensive that become quite famous in World War I. For example, in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, one of the most recognizable American and international heroes of World War I, Alvin York, U.S. Army sergeant, killed 20 to 25 Germans and captured 132 more single-handedly. What makes it interesting is he was a conscientious objector before the war and wasn't interested in serving, and goes on to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service. By the fall of 1918, the Germans are outmanned, outgunned, and starving in the trenches, as well as the Bulgarian soldiers. Another very famous group involved in the Meuse-Argonne is the Lost Battalion. This is guys from the 77th U.S. Infantry Division, roughly 554 men, who were completely surrounded in the Argonne. By the end of the campaign, only 194 members of the Lost Battalion were rescued. They will not be the last group of Americans that will be completely surrounded in the Argonne and Ardennes. We'll talk about a group at the end of World War II that will be trapped near the very same place. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, Germans laid down their arms in an armistice or ceasefire, overthrew the Kaiser, hoping that the Americans would be sympathetic through Wilson's 14 points. And that is why we celebrate Veterans Day or Armistice Day on November 11th. Highly recommended book that I've told you about before, bless you, All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. You should check that out. Or at the very least, one of the film adaptations. Who in here has seen any of those? Nobody? Okay. Check it out. One's pretty new. The constant stream of American military supply and soldiers helped tip the balance for the Allies to win the war. The estimated death toll of World War I, 40 million soldiers and civilians due to combat, genocide, and disease. Keep in mind, very good earlier, the outbreak of the Spanish flu during this war was catastrophic. What are some other World War I diseases that were pretty bad? Trench foot, which was gangrene, typhus, shell shock, dysentery. These are all really bad things. Not to mention the rats in the trenches carried a lot of disease. Also, a lot of these guys were completely riddled with lice. This is pretty nasty. Yeah. All right. On the left, we have Sergeant Alvin York, and on the right, we have the Argonne. The only way that I can describe the Argonne and the Ardennes in this region of Europe, think of like an isolated area in Appalachia. That's a good comparison. That's how heavily forested that region was. And the terrain was super rugged. All right. So now we move on to Wilson's 14 points. On January 8th, 1918, Wilson delivered his 14 points address to Congress. Here were the goals that Wilson set out to have global peace after World War I. I'm not going over all 14, I'm just hitting the highlights. No more secret treaties. Freedom of the seas was to be maintained. A removal of economic barriers among nations. Reduction of armament burdens. A mandate system. An international adjustment of colonial land claims. That obviously had a significant impact in the Middle East and in North Africa. A lot of people, when they talk about the division and struggle in the Middle East, they often want to go back to the end of World War II to find answers. In some cases, you've got to go back to the end of World War I. In some cases, you have to go back even farther. Self-determination or independence for oppressed minority groups to choose their government. One group that's very interesting that was appealing for its independence in post-World War I was Vietnam. And the French were like, sorry, not interested. And then we'll see how that unfolds in the post-World War II era. And then a League of Nations. This is Wilson's baby, okay? This is his goal to create an international organization to keep global peace so there won't be another world war. However, we never join. So what you can see here is a political cartoon showing the bridge, the League of Nations bridge. It says Belgium, France, England, and Italy. There's America. Uncle Sam's resting his head on the keystone. All right. Any questions? Pretty solid cartoon. The Treaty of Versailles, 14 miles outside of Paris. The Paris Conference will meet at Versailles in 1919, summer of 1919. The Big Four, Italy, led by Orlando, France, Clemenceau, Britain, David Lloyd George, and of course, from the U.S., Woodrow Wilson. This is the first time in American history that a sitting president, has gone abroad to negotiate a treaty. Because all the previous treaties that America had negotiated have been negotiated by who? Diplomats. Very good. Who said that? Excellent. Excellent job. All right? Or secretaries of state. But still, diplomats or representatives. There are a lot of conflicting ambitions at Versailles. Britain and France want punishment for Germany. Italy wants more money and more land, notably land claims in North Africa. And the U.S. wants to heal the wounds of the world through the League of Nations. Wilson has to give something up to keep his baby. In order to get everybody on board for the League, he has to agree to France and Britain's desire for a war guilt clause. The war guilt clause put total blame of World War I on Germany. So, Germany gets the blame for the war, and they have to pay $33 billion in reparations, which they will not pay off until 2010. Germany was angry because they didn't have a voice at Versailles, and a couple of other groups that are slighted at Versailles were Russia and Japan. This is going to create tension heading into the post-World War I era. And we're setting up the dominoes and causes for World War II. So on the left is the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors 5 years to the day of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On the right, we have a political cartoon showing the Big Four. You can see Woodrow Wilson there at the end. And on the spoon, it says peace terms, and they're jamming it down Germany's throat. This is setting the tone for another world war. So Wilson returns to America with a copy of the Treaty of Versailles. But the Republican Party is not happy. They felt like they should have had representation at Versailles. Specifically, Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who is chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. He's also an isolationist. He does not want to see America join the League, and he does not want to see America sign off on this treaty. It's time for America to close its doors. There's a lot of fear here. There's fear of us getting sucked into future wars. There's fear of entangling alliances. There's fear of complications with trade. But also, what else does America not want to lose that it's claimed prior to World War I? What do they not want to lose? Very good. They don't want to lose the territories that they gobbled up during the era of imperialism. Okay? So, Wilson takes this to Congress. Congress hands it over to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Henry Cabot Lodge and those committee members tear it apart. And Congress decides that they're not going to sign off on the treaty, and America's not going to join the League. This thing pretty much kills Wilson. He goes on a whistle-stop tour across the country, and in Pueblo, Colorado, trying to get popular support for the treaty and for the League of Nations, he has a stroke that he never really recovers from. In fact, his wife, First Lady Edith Wilson, she pretty much runs the White House for the rest of his term. He will not have the ability to run for re-election. The next president, elected in 1920, Warren G. Harding, conservative Republican, who was an isolationist in league with people like Henry Cabot Lodge, William Borah, and Hiram Johnson. Now America's headed back to an era of isolationism. Woodrow Wilson on the left, Henry Cabot Lodge on the right. We have a cartoon above here that says, "See that horrible vulture? Take it away, take it away." And the vulture is a dove with an olive branch above a sign that says League of Nations. That's a senator wrapped up in his covers. And then below, we have Henry Cabot Lodge walking the torn up Treaty of Versailles out of the operating room. It says Operating Room, Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And the title of the cartoon is The Lamb from the Slaughter. So this is where we wrap up. The legacy of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The French and the English insisted on the punishment of Germany, forcing them to pay reparations and take the blame for World War I. The League of Nations was created, but the U.S. didn't join. National boundaries were redrawn, creating many new nations. Communism will begin to spread in Eastern Europe. Not like on the level it does after World War II, but still, communism is spreading, which is a huge fear in America, tied to isolationism. That's a story for when we get into the Roaring '20s. Most of the 14 points was abandoned, which made Germany feel betrayed. Wilson left Paris unhappy with the finalized treaty, but in the end, the treaty in the League nearly killed the man. Problems continued for the boundaries, economies, governments, and societies of Western and Central Europe. Honestly, you should expand that. It creates problems in North African colonies and countries, as well as the Middle East. So these problems expand beyond Europe. While American entry into World War I ensured Allied victory, the failure to conclude a lasting peace left a bitter legacy. This will eventually set the course of actions that will carry us into the Great Depression and World War II. So, that's all I've got. Any questions up to this point? All right.